Good evening, students. Today we'll be discussing the third part of our Civil War lecture. Please again use Cornell Notes as our way of note-taking for this evening. Again, I would like you to focus on who is the general in charge and how successful they are. Focus on the battles that we're discussing, who won, who lost, and what tactics were employed and what was the significance of the battle. And lastly, strategy. What was the strategy employed by either side and how were they deployed? Once again, today we'll be discussing the third part of the American Civil War, and we will be focusing on the Eastern Theater with special focus on the Battle of Gettysburg. Thank you and enjoy. Most of the Eastern Theater of the war would focus on Virginia. Virginia saw the most fighting of any state during the Civil War because it was the home of both capitals, Washington, D.C. in the north and Richmond in the south, only 90 miles apart from each other. The Peninsula Campaign, which was the largest offensive by the North towards Richmond, happened in Virginia, as well as the Shenandoah Campaign by Stonewall Jackson. And then lastly, today we'll be focusing on the incursions of the Southern forces into northern states, specifically the Battle of Gettysburg, which was the furthest northern push by Southern forces. The first Southern incursion into the northern states happened in 1862 with the Battle of Antietam or Sharpsburg. This was an attempt by Robert E. Lee to get the state of Maryland to secede from the United States and isolating the capital of Washington, D.C. And it was also an attempt to take advantage of overly cautious Union forces and force them to a bargaining table. It was unsuccessful, but it would lead to further attempts within the next year. The major battles of the Eastern Theater were, as I said previously, Antietam, which was the bloodiest single day of the entire war, Fredericksburg, which was the first crack at victory by Ambrose Burnside, which ended in a failure and a massive amount of loss of life, Chancellorsville, which again was where an American forces had the opportunity to destroy the Southern forces, but because of a lack of initiative, eventually lost. And then lastly, Gettysburg. Gettysburg marks the largest battle entirely of the war, the most deaths in any battle during the war, in fact the largest battle in the Western Hemisphere period in history, but in essence would mark a turning point in the war for the Union sides. After the string of victories that Lee put together during the Fredericksburg and Chancellorsville campaigns, he was once again emboldened to invade the North. This time, he would push through Maryland towards Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, in an attempt to disrupt northern shipping and northern railroads. His attempt was to essentially destroy the North's ability to wage war using the railroad. And again, demoralize the northern states by pushing into the north and destroying northern forces on northern soil. The Battle of Gettysburg happened in and around the town of Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, in the south-central portion of Pennsylvania. This would be the largest battle ever in the Western Hemisphere, and it would consist of 3 days of fighting, 1 day more or less in and around the town, and then 2 to 3 days outside in the immediate vicinity of the town. The Union Army during Gettysburg was commanded by General George Meade, who took over control of the Union Army from General Hooker just a few days prior. Now, once again, Lee had shown an initiative in being aggressive in his attacks. So in order to defend the city of Gettysburg, it was imperative for Union forces to gain what high ground they could. Fortunately for them, the city of Gettysburg is surrounded by various hills and ridges that most Union forces were able to occupy prior to day one. One of the weakest parts of the Union Army was their inability to use cavalry effectively. One exception was during Gettysburg and the cavalry officer General John Buford. Buford was able to take the initiative in Gettysburg and use a small cavalry force to gain and utilize three ridges west of Gettysburg, Hare Ridge, McPherson Ridge, and Seminary Ridge, essentially stopping the movement of Confederate troops for a time being and allowing Union troops to essentially mass behind him. These defensive tactics allowed for his forces to slow the spread of the superior Confederate infantry, while allowing the Union infantrymen to occupy strong defensive positions south of the town, specifically on Cemetery Ridge, Culp's Hill, and Cemetery Hill. These positions would be held throughout the rest of the battle. In the beginning of the battle, you would see Union forces, the ones in blue blocks, taking early defensive positions and allowing massive amounts of Union forces to take up more defensive positions to the south of Gettysburg, as we will see by the end of day one. By the end of day one, Union forces retreated down to the larger hills that surrounded the Gettysburg farmland, essentially occupying all high ground that they could in order to stem the flow of the Confederate army. With this high ground, they were able to fire down upon the Confederates throughout the battle, and they would never relinquish the high ground. With day one in the books, we saw the Union forces occupying the best defensive ground, while the Southern forces would be forced to act in the offensive, trying to dislodge Union forces from these grounds, which was a perfect setup for the Union. Day two would pick up with Joshua Chamberlain and his 20th Maine Regiment being sent to the very bottom of the Union line in an attempt to defend the southern slope of a hill called Little Round Top. This portion of the hill was exceedingly important because it exposed the Union flank or the Union side. And Chamberlain, understanding the significance, decided that they would hold this portion of the line at all costs. General Chamberlain and his men would fend off attack after attack after attack as the Confederate troops from the 15th Alabama Regiment charged up the hill to their elevated position. Unfortunately, eventually, the 20th Maine would start to run out of ammunition. With this knowledge, Chamberlain ordered a final bayonet charge in order to destroy Confederate forces. Using the geography to their advantage, the 20th Maine charged down the hill with the left wing of the company wheeling around continuously, essentially to make a hinge, closing the door on the Confederate forces, making a frontal assault and a flanking maneuver all at once. They captured many Confederate soldiers and successfully saved the flank of the Union Army, not ever giving up the hill and not allowing the Confederates to move around and isolate Little Round Top. Here you can see the vista that Chamberlain and his men would have looked down, watching hundreds or thousands of Confederates charge up the hills towards them, using the geography to their advantage and being able to use their defensive position to essentially stop the flow and hold the line, essentially saving the Union on day two. During initial battles, Lee had grown used to aggressiveness taking the day and stemming overcautious Union generals. However, on day one and day two, this proved ineffective. So day three, Lee decided to be aggressive once again and attack the central position of the Union line, figuring if he could crack the Union line, they would be able to take the day and take the battle. In order to do this, Lee ordered a full frontal charge by General George Pickett directly at the Union forces on Cemetery Ridge. Prior to the attack, artillery from the Confederacy would bomb the Federal position, trying to weaken the enemy line. Unfortunately for them, Bombing uphill is much more difficult, and many of their shells fell short of Union lines. Prior to the assault, General George Pickett ordered many of his men to go ahead and organize their effects and essentially write home to their families that they weren't coming back. And around 3 p.m., the cannon fire subsided, and 12,500 Southern soldiers stepped from the ridge line and advanced to 3/4 miles in the open towards Cemetery Ridge. This is known as Pickett's Charge. As the Confederates approached, there was a fierce flanking artillery fire from the Union position on the top of Cemetery Ridge in the north of Little Round Top, and the musket canisters fired from Hancock's 2nd Corps. Nearly half of the Confederate soldiers were cut down in the attack, essentially dying or being injured. While some Confederates made a breakthrough in the Union line at a place called the Angle, reinforcements on the Union side quickly came to their aid and pushed back the Confederate mark. This area is called the high water mark of the Confederacy, basically representing that if there was going to be any sort of victory, it would have happened there. Unfortunately for the Confederates, they were repulsed. The Union carried the day, and Union won the largest battle of the war, and this was a major turning point towards victory. With Pickett's charge being repulsed, the Union had carried the day and had carried the battle, and the Southern forces had nothing to do except retreat back down into the South, back over into Maryland, and eventually back into Virginia. Lee's army, terribly damaged, with roughly half of it suffering some sort of casualty, retreated back into Virginia as hastily as they could. The Northern forces attempted to follow them, but even though they did follow them, they did not attempt to destroy Southern forces. This allowed Lee's army to live to fight another day. Lee and what was left of his army retreated back into Virginia, ending any further advance into the north. Although General George Meade was unable to finish him off, Lee had suffered a loss of about a third of his men, a loss that he would never be able to fully recover from. The victory, coupled with Vicksburg on the 4th of July, gave all the momentum to the Northern cause. However, General George Meade was fired for his failure to destroy the Army of Northern Virginia and was replaced by Ulysses S. Grant, coming off of his victory from Vicksburg. With Grant in control of the Union Army, Lincoln hoped the war would finally be brought to a close. The Battle of Gettysburg is known as one of the most important battles in American history. It was essentially a battle that allowed the North to finally stand up and use its overwhelming power and strength against Southern forces. So again, would you please tell me, why did Gettysburg represent a turning point for the North? Thank you, and we will discuss further in class.